Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening to those in the States, and good morning to those in Japan. Welcome to a collaborative event between the US-Japan Council, Japanese American Citizen League, and USJC's Japanese American Storytelling Program. My name is Lauren Matsumoto. I'm the Membership Engagement and Regional Coordinator for the US-Japan Council, as well as one of the co-organizers for this event. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. I'm looking forward to sharing this knowledge with everyone. This is very personally important to me as a granddaughter of former incarcerees. Before we get started, there are a few things that I like to go over. Firstly, this introduction and the presentation portion of our programming will be recorded. For the privacy and comfortability for our participants, the Q&A session and the discussion groups will not be recorded, so please bring your hard-hitting questions during that time. Secondly, most of this programming will be primarily in English. However, huge shout out to our JAS interns, Serena and Akko. They will be translating from English to Japanese and Japanese to English. So feel free to put in the chat any comments or questions in either in English or in Japanese. Lastly, before we get started, I'd like to say a huge thank you to USJC sponsors. Our programming and today's event would only be made possible from the generosity of our sponsors. Thank you to our platinum sponsors, Amazon, American Airlines, Eritani Foundation, Deloitte, Fabit, and MUFG, as well as thank you to our title sponsors, CPB Foundation, Google, Hitachi, Mr. Yosuke, Honjo, Island Insurance Foundation, Itoen, Mitsui, NEC, Oryx, Terasaki Nibe Foundation, the Toshizo Watanabe Foundation, and the Toyota Research Institute, as well as thank you to our other sponsors. We truly appreciate your generosity and support. Thank you again to our sponsors. Now, I'd love to introduce USJC Council Leader, organizer of the Japanese American Storytelling Program, as well as one of the co-organizers of this event, Jim Minamoto. Take it away, Jim.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And let me say thank you very much to you. Today's program would not have been possible without Lauren's assistance and organization. She may or may not have mentioned it, but she's the USJC Membership Engagement and Regional Coordinator. So I'd like to give a kind of round of applause to Lauren for her organization. So today we're very fortunate to have a special educational program, which I think has very, very long-lasting consequences. My name is Jim Minamoto, and it's my pleasure today to serve as moderator for this program, which is entitled The Power of Words, Euphemisms, and the Japanese American Experience. So before introducing our speaker today, I'd like to just mention that we are really, really lucky to have quite a diverse audience with us today. So in addition to speakers of our Japanese American Storytelling Program, we have a number of host professors. These are professors at Japanese universities who are kind enough to host one of our speakers, some of them for a number of years. In addition, we have some US-Japan Council Japan region members present, staff and interns, friends and supporters of the organization as well. So it's quite a good mix of attendees today. And I also would like to give a special shout out to our two interns, Akko Degawa and Serena Noma. As Lauren mentioned, they'll be helping out with some translations as necessary. So let's get started. So let me start by asking some questions. Do we use the word internment, or do we say incarceration? Do we say relocation or forced removal? And does it really matter? And if so, why? what are the downsides and upsides of using euphemisms versus more historically accurate terms. Euphemisms, for those who may be Japanese speakers, I think the term is enkyoku hyogen. And if we start to change our terminology, would we be actually rewriting history? So if you've ever wondered about any of these kinds of questions, you are in the right place. And it occurred to me that since all of us here interact in some way with students, if we are using terminology that is not really the most accurate, we're actually kind of perpetuating, spreading out information which is not as accurate as it should be. So that's why I mentioned, I think that this program has really, really long-lasting consequences. So Matthew Weisbly is the Education and Communications Coordinator for the Japanese American Citizens League, JACL, in the LA office. Matt is a graduate of USC, University of Southern California, go Trojans, with a degree in Japanese and Japanese American history. And he also double minored in East Asian languages and cultures and cinematic arts. His senior thesis explored demographic data and oral histories of Nisei soldiers with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. I should also mention that Matt is of Japanese, Jewish, and Chinese heritage. So I think he's very, very well placed to talk about the topics that we have scheduled for today. So with that, Matt, let me turn things over to you, and the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. And just a huge shout out again to Jim Minamoto, as well as Lauren Matsumoto, as well as all of USJC for inviting me here today. I'm very, very excited to be here with you all today. Like Jim said, my name is Matthew Weisbly. I serve as the Education Communications Coordinator for the Japanese American Citizens League, based out of Los Angeles in Little Tokyo. But before we get into today's program, just wanted to give you a little bit more background about myself and about the power of words. So for myself, like Jim mentioned, I am a Gosei, a fifth generation Japanese American on my grandfather's side. And my grandfather and his family were forcibly removed and incarcerated in Gila River, Arizona, which is where I partially grew up. And so that history and the story of my grandfather and his family is really what drove me to do this work and drove me to be a part of the JACL and other Japanese American organizations today. So moving on a little bit to the power of words, this program started back in 2013 when the JACL came together as an organization and decided that they would put efforts towards educating the general public on the terminology and on definitions surrounding the Japanese American experience during World War II. So they put money towards creating this booklet, which is a physical booklet, as you can see here. And it's had different iterations over the years. The most recent iteration was this past year, updating it, making it more relevant, updating definitions and such. And we use it for a variety of different things, like we use it for programs like this, where we talk to the public and talk to them about the terminology and about the definitions that surround this experience. But we also give it out to educators, to government officials, and to other organizers who are trying to do this work and who really want to learn about the Japanese American experience during World War II and really what it means. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started into today's program. Before we actually look at the terms themselves, just want to give a little bit of background on dictionary definitions and euphemistic terms. So the definition for a euphemism is a mild word or expression substituted for one that's considered blunt or embarrassing. And it comes from the Greek euphemismos, which means to use auspicious words. And those formative elements are eu, meaning well, and pheme, meaning speaking. So in other words, well speaking. In the more modern times, the author William Safire says that a euphemism, to some degree, euphemisms is a strategic misrepresentation. And so we can kind of see that in our in our society and in our everyday lives. Some examples might be that in most societies, we don't like talking about the idea of death. So instead of saying that someone died, we might say that they passed away or they were departed. And this is the same in Japanese. For example, the word death, shi, sounds a lot like the number 4, as you probably know. And so oftentimes the number 4 is substituted with the phrase yon instead, which is a different word origin. And it's often used when talking about prices and numbers. However, as we will soon find out throughout this program, euphemisms can be used for other purposes and are often purposeful alternatives with hidden motives. So our first word that we'll go over is evacuate and evacuation. And the dictionary defines this verb and noun as the process of temporarily moving people away from an immediate and real danger, such as fire, flood, shootout, or bomb threat. And it's used to describe the forced removal of Japanese Americans by the federal government during World War II from their homes on the West Coast in Arizona is completely inaccurate. They were not evacuated to protect themselves from any disastrous environment. And so by using these words, the government only made it seem that these individuals were being helped. So instead, we recommend the words forced removal to be used in this situation, as it more accurately describes that lack of choice the Japanese Americans were given when ordered to leave their homes by the US Army and the US government. Similarly, we have the words relocate and relocation. And these terms suggest that people voluntarily moved from one location to another, that being their private homes to the War Relocation Authority camps and other government-run facilities. And its usage obscures the fact that the US military forced, again, all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, which we'll come back to those definitions later, but forced all the Japanese persons to leave their homes and many of their belongings behind, often with less than a week's notice, and in some cases only 48 hours notice. So just like the terms evacuate and evacuation, in this sense, we would use the phrase forced removal again, which more accurately shows that lack of choice the Japanese Americans were given during the forced relocation. And then we come to perhaps the biggest term that is today associated with the incarceration and with the entire period of World War II is the word internment. And so the word internment has a legal definition that refers to the confinement or impounding of enemy aliens during a time of war. And there actually were internees, and there was an internment during the war. However, it was a much smaller percentage of what would become the larger incarceration of Japanese Americans. So those internees were those that were picked up soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and they were sent to camps operated by the Department of Justice. As such, these internees were protected by the Geneva Conventions, which came about during World War I. And these protections that were given to these few internees were not available to those who were sent to the main incarceration camps. Most of the several tens of thousands of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during the camps in World War II were American citizens. 2/3 of those 120,000 were actually American citizens and not enemy aliens. Thus, the term internee and those Geneva Convention protections do not apply to them. So you have roughly only about 17,000 men and women who comprise that definition of internment and internee, including those from Latin American countries, and they were sent to Department of Justice camps through family reunification programs. But again, that's only about 17,000 out of 120,000 who actually qualify for that definition. So outside of those who were internees and sent to actual internment camps, the majority of those Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II, we would say were incarcerated. As such, that is the recommended definition. Incarceration more accurately describes those that were held in the WRA camps. And to incarcerate is generally defined as to confine or imprison, typically as punishment for a crime. And this term reflects the prison-like conditions that Japanese Americans faced in the camps, as well as the view that they were being treated as if guilty of sabotage, espionage, and or suspect loyalty by the US Army and the US government. And moving on to the physical locations themselves, we first have the assembly centers. So when Japanese Americans were first initially forced to leave their homes, they were directed to live in what was called temporary assembly centers. The official names were the Wartime Civil Control Administration camps, which essentially was a branch of the US Army. And these makeshift detention centers were often crudely fashioned from animal stalls at racetracks and fairgrounds, oftentimes still emitting the stench of animal waste, being quickly whitewashed and still dirty, but were surrounded by barbed wire fences with searchlights and armed soldiers to contain people of Japanese ancestry within. And again, the euphemistic nature of this term hid the degrading lack of amenities and crude living spaces in these facilities. And for example, on December 18th, 1944, then Supreme Court Justice Owen J. Roberts stated that an assembly center is a euphemism for a prison, and so-called relocation centers are a euphemism for concentration camps. And so when talking about assembly centers, instead, the more accurate term is a temporary detention facility or detention center. And a detention center is generally a place where prisoners are temporarily held pending some further disposition, which was the case for many Japanese Americans during World War II before they were sent to the larger WRA concentration camps. And discussion of some historical contexts, such as talking about the names of these centers, such as Fresno Assembly Center or Santa Anita Assembly Center, you would actually use the given name of it, again, saying Assembly Center in it. However, we would recommend that you put those in quotation marks and really only use that term when talking about the actual names of these places. Otherwise, you often refer to them as Fresno Temporary Detention Center or, again, Santa Anita Temporary Detention Center. And finally, we have, again, one of the largest and most common words, again, coming back to the idea of internment camps and then also relocation centers. So this term, like assembly center, was used by the government to give an impression to the general public that the forcible removal of Japanese Americans to pleasant summer-like camp facilities. And it's a somewhat innocuous imagery, was in stark contrast to the reality which many Japanese Americans faced. They were sent to camps in the middle of deserts and swamps, where they lived in tar paper wooden barracks that were hastily built on these harsh, desolate conditions, where they were surrounded by barbed wire fences, guard towers with machine guns, and sentries with their guns pointed inward, not outward. And so while you hear the terms internment camp and relocation center, the more accurate definition actually is American concentration camp. And there's a distinction there. Again, you hear the word concentration camp, which for many people now has the connotation of being associated with those camps that were in Europe during World War II as well, during the Holocaust, where the Nazis persecuted and then murdered millions of Jews. And there actually was some debate over this between the American Jewish community as well as the Japanese American community. And they've come to a consensus that the term American concentration camp is the preferred one. However, there are alternatives if someone does not feel comfortable using the term concentration camp. You can also say incarceration camps as well as illegal detention centers. And oftentimes in literature, you might hear the three of those used interchangeably, or you'll hear people use one or the other as their preferred terminology for what they call these camps. And so, again, just like assembly centers, though, in discussions of certain historical contexts, the phrase relocation camp may be appropriate only as part of the proper name of those camps. Again, things like Gila River Relocation Center or Manzanar Relocation Center. But for the most part, again, you would use the term American concentration camp, incarceration camp, or illegal detention center. So I know that's a lot to be thrown at you all at once. So I have a handy little quick review for everybody just to go over what we've spoken about the last few minutes, as well as give you some ideas for some other terms that you might come across when talking about Japanese American history that actually are euphemisms. So again, we have evacuation, where the accurate terms are actually exclusion and forced removal. Relocation is really incarceration in camps, and this is also used after the camps as well. You have non-aliens. I mentioned this earlier. So non-aliens are actually American citizens of Japanese ancestry. It was a way for the government to not say American citizens, but to just treat Japanese Americans who are citizens as enemies, just like their parents who could not be citizens. You have civilian exclusion orders, which are the orders that eventually led to forced removal, and these more accurately are called detention orders. You'll see the phrase any and all persons, or any or all persons, and this primarily refers to people of Japanese ancestry during those detention and removal orders. The term may be excluded really means to be evicted from one's home. You'll hear the word Native American aliens. And these are a specific group of Japanese Americans who were known as renunciants, American citizens who, under pressure by the US Army and US government, were forced basically to renounce their US citizenship. Again, the term assembly center is really temporary detention facility. Relocation center is really American concentration camp, and incarceration camp, illegal detention center, where the inmates held in these camps were known as incarcerees. And then internment center, were specifically those DOJ and Army camps which held enemy aliens under the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 and were protected by the Geneva Convention, as mentioned earlier. So I know that was a lot to get through and a lot of information to go through, and I really hope that you learned a lot during this presentation. I know we still got a bit more time, so I will hand it back over to Jim, who I believe is going to lead us through a Q&A session. So go ahead, Jim, and take it away.